Hello, in this demonstration we are going to look at the bones of the vertebral column. We will look at the typical vertebra by using one of the cervical vertebra and look at the different structures associated with any of the typical vertebra. The one that is shown now, that is your sixth cervical vertebra. A general structure which is present in the vertebra is body of the vertebra, which is seen on the ventral aspect of the vertebra. As we see it from the lateral side, we can orient ourselves looking at the vertebra. I am holding the spine of the spinous process of the vertebra, that is the caudal end of the vertebra, and that is the cranial end of the vertebra. The part which is seen on the lower side of the vertebra, that is the body of the vertebra. Then the middle part of the vertebra is actually the vertebral arch or vertebral arc. The different processes that we see in this particular vertebra, those are the transverse process, the spinous process, the cranial articular process, and the caudal articular process. Let's look at the cranial view of the vertebra so we understand the relation between the body and the arc of the vertebra. So this is the body of the vertebra located more ventrally, which actually forms the bulk of the bone. We see the cranial end of the body of the vertebra. Usually the cranial end, you will find the articular surface of the body is convex, might show a little notch in the middle or little depression in the middle, but then in general the articular face or articular surface is convex in nature. If I turn it around and we go to the caudal articular surface of the vertebral body, you will find the caudal articular surface is concave. It is depressed towards the center, and so this articular surface we see of the caudal aspect of the body of the vertebra, that is the concave articular surface. Let's go back to the cranial view, look at some other features. On the dorsal aspect of the body of the vertebra, we have the vertebral arc. Now the vertebral arc is formed by two different parts. The pedicle, which is located on the lateral sides. Pedicles, they form the wall of the vertebra or wall of the vertebral foramen, which is the space right on top of the vertebral body. The walls of the vertebral foramen are formed by the pedicles, one on each side, and the roof of the vertebral foramen is formed by the lamina of the vertebra. So that structure here is lamina, and that structure here is the pedicle, and pedicle one on each side. And that's how it forms the vertebral foramen, where the roof is formed by the lamina and walls are formed by the pedicles. Now these two parts are the major parts of the vertebra which are present in all the vertebrae and may be modified depending upon the need. Let's look at the lateral view. Again, we see the cranial end of the vertebra, here, and the caudal end of the vertebra. The cranial articular surface is convex, while the caudal articular surface is concave. Now, along the pedicle, there are certain parts which can be seen. The process, the notch which is present on the caudal aspect of the pedicle, which is the caudal pedicular notch or caudal vertebral notch. The similar notch is present in the cranial end of the pedicle as well, that is the cranial pedicular notch or cranial vertebral notch. These notches are important in terms of forming the intervertebral foramina. Intervertebral foramina allow the spinal nerves to come out of the neural canal. Okay, now let's look at the different processes of the vertebra which are usually present. We can see the cranial. We are now looking at the cranial view of the same vertebra again. Here we see the vertebral body. The processes which are going away from the vertebra, one on each side, these are the transverse processes. The transverse process, the cranial articular surface of the body. The rest of the body is located down here. The cranial articular process on the other side. Then we see from top we see the articular area associated with the cranial articular process again articular area associated with the cranial articular process. On top, pointed upward, and depending upon the region of the vertebrae, it could be either pointed upward and forward or upward and backward. In the cervical region as well as in the lumbar region in the dog, the spinous processes of the vertebrae are directed upward as well as directed cranially. But in the thoracic region, the same spinous processes for the first 10 vertebrae are pointed backward and dorsally. Okay? So that is the spinous process, that is the transverse process, that is the body of the vertebra, that is the vertebral arc with pedicles on each side and lamina on top. Basically, the lamina on both sides, they will fuse to form the roof of the vertebral column or a vertebral foramen. And so, when we combine all the vertebral foramina of all the vertebrae, it forms a passage which is your neural canal. Now here we see articular surface of the cranial articular process. When we see the articular surface from the ventral view, you can see the articular surface. We can see the articular surface of the caudal articular process as well. Caudal articular process and the articular surface of the caudal articular process. There are a few more processes which are present in the typical vertebra. Those we can see on some other vertebrae because they may not be so evident in the cervical vertebra. Let's put the cervical vertebra aside and we'll consider one of the lumbar vertebra to consider some of the processes that we cannot see on the cervical vertebra. Now this is one of the lumbar vertebra of the dog. We see the cranial end of the vertebra. The transverse process is here from the dorsal view. The cranial end of the vertebra and the caudal end of the vertebra. The transverse processes here are directed laterally as well as cranially. The transverse process laterally and cranially, transverse process laterally and cranially. The spinous process in this case is directed upward as well as directed cranially. Then along with this we have the cranial articular process, the caudal articular process and the caudal articular process. When we see that from the lateral view, when you see the lumbar vertebra from the lateral view, we will observe few more structures associated with that. Close to the cranial articular process and its articular surface, we see a small projection which is called the mammillary process. So the structure which is closely associated with the cranial articular process, which points out more upward, that is called mammillary process. From the mammillary process and we come back, you're going to find another spine-shaped structure right here, that is the accessory process. Okay, so we have the mammillary process, the accessory process. The caudal articular process again with its articular surface, and then spinous process on top where two laminae they join each other. The caudal vertebral notch or caudal pedicular notch can be seen here, and also the cranial pedicular notch is seen clearly on this particular specimen. In this demonstration, we are going to look at cervical vertebrae. Now here we are looking at the first cervical vertebra, which is called atlas. This cervical vertebra is a key point where the skull is articulated with the rest of the vertebral column. Depending upon the moves or depending upon the movements which are necessary in the head, the vertebra is completely modified and it does not really look like any typical vertebra. The body of the vertebra is modified. We don't see much of the body of the vertebra left here. Instead, it has become more flat and has become very short as well. This is the ventral view of the atlas. We see the vertebral body has become very short and it is even in the form of flat lamina, and so it is called ventral lamina. The body is modified into ventral lamina. A little part which projects backward from the ventral lamina, it is the ventral tubercle. As we see the cranial view of the vertebra, In this cranial view, we see the articular surface for the occipital condyle of the occipital condyle of the skull. From the dorsal view, we see the lamina of the vertebra is still there. The pedicular part is slightly extending more laterally, that is the pedicular part, but then everything looks like a broad lamina on the dorsal aspect. The transverse processes are completely modified. Those are not as thin and spreading out as we saw them in the typical vertebra, but here they are more flat, extending almost along the length of the vertebra, and that's why they are referred to as wings of the atlas. The wings of the atlas are one of the important landmarks which can also be palpated on the live animal, and you can palpate these edges of the wing of the atlas in the live animal. In the caudal view of the vertebra, we see another articular face or another articular surface which is for articulation with the body of the axis, which is second cervical vertebra. From the cranial view, we see the central vertebral foramen, which is as usual. Then we see there is in the lateral view, we see a foramen which is located right here. At the cranial end of the vertebra, a foramen is located which communicates the vertebral foramen to the exterior. And that foramina, one on each side, those are for passage of the first cervical spinal nerve. Then as we come a little bit more caudally, we see another foramen which actually runs or which is directed along the length of the vertebra, which is for the passage of the blood vessels through the wing of the atlas, and the vertebral artery and vein is going to pass through that foramen, so it is called transverse vertebral foramen. Transverse vertebral foramen on the other side, transverse vertebral foramen on this side. So we see the transverse vertebral foramina and we can see through them in this particular view, that is the caudodorsal view. I can see the transverse vertebral foramen. From the lateral view, I can see the lateral vertebral foramen which is going or which is through and through lateral vertebral foramen. The caudal view of the bone, the dorsal lamina, the ventral lamina, articular face, articular surface for the body of the axis. At the cranial end again, we see two notches. Those are called alar notches. So this is alar notch on the left hand side, that is the alar notch on the right hand side. Dorsal view of the vertebra or dorsal lamina of the vertebra, but the spinous processes are not present, and the cranial and caudal articular processes are also not present. One of the important features to notice here, the atlas does not have any cartilaginous articulation either with the skull or with the following vertebra. It is cranially articulated with the skull by means of atlanto-occipital joint, which is a synovial joint, and caudally to the axis, which is also a synovial joint. Along the ventral lamina, when we see it from the caudodorsal aspect, we see an indentation. That indentation is for the dens, which is part of the axis, which is going to protrude through the vertebral foramen. So this is for, or this indentation is for the odontoid process or dens of the axis. Okay, so these are the major features of the first cervical vertebra, which is called atlas, which is completely modified in order to provide articulation of the skull to the rest of the vertebral column. The second cervical vertebra, which is called axis. The cranial view of the axis bone or axis vertebra, the lateral view of the axis vertebra, the caudal view of the axis vertebra, dorsal part, the ventral part, the cranial view, the dorsal aspect, and the ventral aspect of the vertebra. Now what we see here in the axis is the place where the vertebra is changing its shape back to the typical vertebra. So at the cranial end of the axis, that is the cranial end of the axis, we see the convex articular surface, and this is the body of the axis at the caudal end, which shows the concave articular surface. Okay, so let's go back to the cranial end. At the cranial end, the axis is articulated with the atlas, and so the moments which are present in this joint are quite different than what moments are further required between the axis and the third cervical vertebra and onwards. So here body is being transformed to a typical vertebral body at the caudal end of the vertebra, while at the cranial end of the vertebra it is modified to form a synovial joint. Now in this view we can see a small projection protruding forward even much beyond the body of the axis, that is called odontoid process or dens of the axis. That articular surface is going to fit into the caudal articular fovea of the atlas, which is meant for atlanto-axial joint. From the cranial view, again we see the body of the axis, arc of the vertebra, that is arc of the axis, and then we see the pedicle, and the lamina. Along the midline, along the dorsal midline, the spinous process is present. The spinous process is flat and it extends all the way through the length of the vertebra. Even at the cranial end, it projects further beyond the body of the vertebra. It projects further beyond the vertebral arc. The dorsal view, cranial end of the vertebra, the caudal end of the vertebra. In the dog, nuchal ligament ends at the axis. It does not reach the skull, and so here we see some of the rough articular or rough area of attachment between the ligament and the vertebra. Okay, now let's look at the other processes and other structures which are associated with this vertebra. From the caudal view, some of the structures are now, we can see the transverse process, the caudal articular surface of the body of the vertebra, which is concave in nature, the caudal pedicular notch, the vertebral arc with caudal articular process, and the articular surface of the caudal articular process. Caudal articular process and the articular surface on the left hand side as well. The vertebral foramen. So when you look at the caudal end of the axis, it almost follows or it almost shows the structures which would be seen in any of the typical vertebra, except the cranial articular processes are not present because those are not needed. The lateral foramen is not present here because there is a space between the atlas and axis where the intervertebral foramen can be formed and the spinal nerve can come out through the intervertebral foramen. But we do have the transverse vertebral foramen, which allows passage of the vertebral artery and vein along the side of the vertebra. So this is your transverse vertebral foramen, which is very close to the which is at the beginning of the transverse process of the axis. The main feature of the axis is the dens or odontoid process. As we discussed earlier, we try relating the axis and the atlas and we try to put them in the order where they would be seen. The dens or odontoid process protrudes through the atlas and it almost makes contact with the skull bone.